So the setup for Arnold is quite easy. Again, I'm going to select everything using my shortcut Control-Shift-A. If anything's in a layer, by the way, and it's locked or in reference, you can just simply turn off reference so you can grab everything. So in here, I'm going to literally right-click, go to Assign New Material, and I'm going to click on Arnold, and there should be AI Ambient Occlusion. Okay. And right away, we're going to kind of see it look differently. So you can choose to view this in the viewport, although I usually prefer to have the separate interactive production render, the IPR renderer. So we see that here. Let me just zoom out so I can sort of see the full frame. Okay, so that's the renderer there, and it's kind of cranking it out. Now it's 10 seconds for this. It's full HD. And I want to show you a few things you can try to do to speed up your render. So under render settings, Arnold renderer, I can turn off basically specular, transmission, subsurface scatter, and indirect volume. That can potentially help speed up the render. I think the calculation is still going to roughly be the same since it's the only shader in the scene. And in terms of quality, there's a couple of things that affect this. The first thing is obviously camera samples. So the lower the samples, right, the chunkier the scene looks, right? So if I go really, really low, you see it's very, very blocky. So usually you need to be between 2 and 4 samples, and diffuse samples to be, again, 2 is usually enough, 3 or 4 is okay. And if I click on the material, let me just go into the material here. There's also samples in here as well. So if you bump that up to 4 or 5, you can really get rid of some of the noise in here, okay? But again, as the samples go up, the render times go up. There's a lot of kind of multiplication factors that happen there. So you do want to be a bit careful about just kind of cranking these samples. Again, if it's 10, 15 seconds, maybe it's not such a big deal. But I'm usually focused as a sort of solo, one-person mini studio freelancer. I usually work on trying to produce quality and speed in a very budget-friendly time frame. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways to kind of work. This is still rendering. It's like 20 seconds now, 21 seconds with these higher samples, right? But it is a fair bit smoother. So usually what I do actually to speed this up, especially if it's not like a sequence, it's a still image just to show clients or whatever, I'll drop my samples back down on the occlusion render. And in system, right now the CPU is cranking this scene out. And since it's a very simple scene of just mesh, no textures, doesn't have a ton of textures, the CPU isn't really necessary. Most graphics cards of the last, I would say, 3-4 years plus, whether they're professional or gaming cards, can handle these kinds of scenes. So I would switch to GPU, that's your graphics card. So the graphics card will render this, and it'll typically be a fair bit quicker. And if we go into Arnold, all you have left to deal with now is basically the actual camera samples, which is a nice change. I typically will also enable, if it's available, the progressive render. So just stop that. So that means you'll sort of see like very, very kind of like spotty, splotchy looking renders, and then it'll kind of slowly kind of pop in basically. In this case, it doesn't seem like I have access to it, but that's fine. So I'll show you again. Like if I just go to Arnold renderer and I'll hit play, the render basically takes 0 seconds, but you can see it's noisy. So we can try this with 3 samples. It's only taking a second. 6 samples, it's only taking about 3 seconds. So it's actually doing quite well with this graphics card or GPU-based rendering. Now, again, I like speed, and sometimes I'll sacrifice a tiny bit of quality. So you can still keep your samples ultra low, let's say to 2 or 3. And under imagers, we have 2 different types that I will use. One is called denoiser optics. So whenever there's a little bit of that kind of graininess in your image, this is for NVIDIA graphics cards only. So it doesn't really work with AMD graphics cards or other like Intel cards. So this will automatically denoise this and give it a much more pleasant, smooth appearance. Okay, so I find that great. Now, if you do happen to have a non-AMD graphics card, you can remove this and add the denoiser noise. This is developed by Arnold itself, so it doesn't matter what the hardware is. It'll basically denoise it, and it's also kind of optimized for like render sequences. Okay, so it's good if you do want to do, let's say, a quick sequence and render, let's say with the GPU. You could potentially do that with the noise denoiser, but this does take a little bit longer to process. So I find in this case I'm getting as good results with the optics. So I'm going to right click, remove, and then go to add the optics. Now there are some other options you can kind of blend, so you can have kind of a little bit of noise, which maybe makes it look a little bit more like film. I usually don't play with these settings pretty much at all, so these are fine. And one last thing to talk about in terms of the color sometimes. So I noticed a lot of times this happens with color management. If you go into settings under color management, you do want to apply what's called a render transform. So typically when you're kind of quickly saving out still images, they're going to be a JPEG, a PNG maybe, and also they will usually be 8 bits per channel, which means that the total number of colors is about 16 million. So HDR, or high dynamic range images, which are HDR format, EXR format, those kinds of images are really like serious high-level professional formats. They're typically 16 bits per channel plus, and they can display something like 237 trillion possible colors. So, and our displays as well, there's a lot that goes into color management. Basically, our monitors are only 8-bit currently. Newer monitors that are HDR maybe support 10, 12, or 16-bit. So a lot of times what's happening in the software is actually being translated between trillions of colors and millions of colors and billions of colors. So I do think it can ensure that you have a better output just to turn on the apply output transform. So that if you're going to save from this little window, right, so let's say I go File, Save Image. I'll just save it over this other one here. Replace, yes. It's just going to make sure that the image is as it was rendered. So it's going to be displayed the same way as it was rendered. In previous versions of Maya, sometimes you'd have really drastic differences between what you see in the Arnold render view and what saves out from here. So I think it currently works well. It's become more streamlined. Final step here, just to talk about the wireframe version with Arnold, is I usually will simply go into Hypershade. And in Hypershade, you can select your material. So I'm going to select the AI ambient and hit this. There's a key here called Input-Output Connection Map. So if you click on that, it just shows you the nodes that are kind of connected to this that make up the material. And then I'm going to click on the Arnold category and type in wire. So there is an AI Arnold wireframe material. And I'll just show you what that looks like. So if I select everything here and say apply existing AI wire, and I'll pop back open that preview render. Right, we're seeing, it's kind of doing all triangles, which I don't typically like. So I'm going to go into the wireframe material, just set it to polygons. Okay, and then we'll get a better render that way. Okay. And finally, so there's a fill color, right? So you can take that fill color and make it something else, like whatever, green or whatever the case may be. And you'll get something like that, which is not the greatest look, but you can actually just plug in the output, the output color of the ambient occlusion and plug it into the fill color here. So now that material is applied, we're getting ambient occlusion plus wireframe, which again is usually a fairly nice way to sort of see your render, see the mesh, see what the scene is made up of. So again, I find these to be all fairly useful options. And again, we can increase samples as well just to sharpen things up a bit. Yeah, and just one final note, you can increase or decrease the line width. So maybe if it's being, sometimes if certain areas are too dense, you can dial it down and find a happy medium between sort of showing off what's there, making sure the lines are visible based on the resolution and framing. So that's another good option to play with.